If you and I want to influence others in service to Christ, then, like our church leaders should be doing, we need to examine where specifically we might be losing control over ourselves. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now, I'm going to attempt to examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language we can easily take for granted, digging into history and languages, as I'm able anyway, to try and get at the heart of the text so that we can hopefully see and then apply at least some of what God has for you and me in these words today. Now, I'm not formally trained in Scripture. I'm just a guy using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth. And that's something that we can all do, so I hope you'll do that with me. We're in part 3 of a broader look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 13, although after starting with kind of an overview of all those verses, we're now going much more slowly through shorter portions of it because there can be a lot packed into these. We're just actually going to look at verse 3 this time, and I know I said last time I thought we'd start moving through the verses faster, but I forgot how verses that are largely just listing qualities can take extra time and care. Next time we should be able to cover at least 4 through 5, maybe 4 through 7, but thank you for your patience. I do think it's important to slow down this much when a single verse has a lot of ideas packed into it. We're first in priority, because it's the purpose of this passage, looking at the qualifications for overseers or elders, the highest office in the local church, who aim in a plurality of leadership to lead the local church as they submit to Jesus, who is the actual head of the church. Verse 3 then says that an overseer or elder should be not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, and that's in the ESV translation. In addition to considering the relevance of this passage for church elders, we've also been recognizing that these qualifications are things we should all be aspiring to, especially in this social media age, I think, in which so many of us end up expressing ourselves online with some desire to be heard in order to influence others. We think that our views, our opinions have merit, have value that others should consider, and consider sharing those views with us. And when we seek to influence, we are really seeking to lead, in a sense. And so these qualifications are very relevant to all of us in principle. So first up in this verse, not a drunkard. This can also be translated not addicted to wine, or not given to wine. It can also refer to someone who is quarrelsome, brawling, or abusive because of wine. This should not be a trait of someone serving as an elder in a church, and it shouldn't be true of those of us who share our thoughts in a desire to influence others. I mean, it shouldn't be true of any believers. This issue of, not being a drunkard seems to have been specified because of regrettable cultural norms that existed at the time, and is ultimately just a more specific application of the broader idea of being self-controlled, rather than being controlled by desires or substances. Self-control is a qualification we saw in verse 2. The fact that not being a drunkard is then specified when the broader principle has already been covered, I think should give us reason to look at our own situations and ask, okay, so what's the specific thing that tends to control me? Paul already covered self-control. He already mentioned self-control, but he emphasizes it by touching on a specific way that one can lack self-control. So maybe our issue isn't alcohol, but you and I, given Paul's approach here, would do well to ask ourselves, well, what is maybe my specific thing that potentially takes control of my emotions in a negative way? When our boys were very young, a difficult stage for most any parent that I was in as well, just having young kids, I discovered at that time that I was being controlled by a desire to have a certain amount of hobby time to myself. I even became irritable and entitled if too much of my hobby time was overtaken by other things, such as having out-of-town visitors or other life circumstances. I've never been drunk and have barely even ingested alcoholic beverages my whole life. That's not a moral stance. I just think it tastes gross. But here I was, falling into an attitude of anger that affected my wife because of the pull that my hobbies had on me. And even today, I feel that potential to hold on to my hobby time too tightly. And so I have to be intentional to avoid that. And now, as an elder at my church, I definitely have to go without some of the hobby time that I've gotten used to having for years. Though I'm certainly reminded I could still grow so much more in that area for the sake of the church, for the sake of course, my family. So again, it may not be alcohol, but there may be something else that compromises our self-control or our emotional steadiness, and we can benefit from exploring that in ourselves. Next up, not violent, but gentle. This is an interesting one. The Greek word for violent here, well, yeah, it just refers to someone who hits someone, strikes someone else. So we're getting a picture here of a church being built out of a pretty rough crowd of people, given that Paul felt the need to list this as a quality. It actually needed to be said that someone in the highest leadership role of the church should not be the type that hits other people. In some ways, though, I'm kind of encouraged by this, ironically, because this means that even in these rough places, with only rough people to choose from, where Paul had to say something like this, God can still place his church in those places with leaders who may have some rough edges to their personality, but are still used by God to help lead his people. Timothy clearly had a rough group to work with, but Paul didn't give up on that community or demand that leaders be imported from somewhere else. He gave instruction based on where the people were at in this area. And that's awesome that God still wants to build his church, even in rough places where you have to say, hey, elders should not be the type that hit other people. That said, perhaps more relevant to us is the fact that violence is contrasted with the required quality of being gentle, which in the Greek here refers to being fair-minded and mild. Influential Christians, leading Christians, should not be known for starting up conflict. They need to be fair-minded and be known for bringing peace to conflict situations. This is carried over into the relational sense with the next qualification, not quarrelsome. I mean, certainly our leaders should be mild in the sense of not starting up fistfights, but also not quarrelsome. This is someone who's not contentious. Some people thrive on debating, but a church leader cannot have this kind of trait. In my church in particular, it would make it very difficult to make decisions as an elder board together, because we have as a value that we make decisions not based on a majority vote, but on full consensus. We come to full agreement, and then we move forward on a decision. Sometimes disagreement is necessary, but in those times our aim should not be to win a debate, but to win over each other, or be won over by good reasoning, patience, and a unifying desire to die to ourselves in submission to Christ while seeking the best for the church. Christian geeks need to pursue these qualities too. It can be, of course, enjoyable. I'm sure we've all experienced to some degree just kind of the fun of hashing out our different opinions on topics of entertainment. But that can, at some point, take a turn for the worse and actually cause friction in a conversation that is just not worth having friction in. Even worse, when we then have something to say online or to talk about with others, we can be in that same mode of quarrelsome communication styles. When we're, talking about, whatever, but especially that's an issue if we're talking about something that's actually of substance, that's actually has some weight to it. We may believe that we're expressing truth that needs to be heard and accepted, but if we deliver it in a quarrelsome way of communicating, we're not leading anyone in those moments. We're not effectively influencing, except maybe those who become intimidated by us, which is really, we should not be satisfied with that. That's a very unhealthy way for anyone to change their mind about something. And I want to say as a bit of an aside that I don't think people who come across as intimidating and quarrelsome online, I don't think they necessarily think of themselves that way. I think that sometimes we can be trying to be bold. Maybe we're even dealing with a difficult decision to express a truth that we know might result in harsh responses. And so we might kind of be gearing up to declare the truth that we believe needs to be said, even though we're kind of like, okay, there might be some backlash, but here I go, gotta be bold, gotta be strong. And then at some point in the gearing up for that, we can miss the important step of considering how our words can be not merely heard, but also considered and found persuasive. So instead of coming across as quarrelsome or thriving on debate, we should aim to communicate truth online and in person in a way that is clear and truthful, but also gentle, reasonable and winning people over through persuasion with the truth rather than by inadvertent intimidation. If we want to lead and influence others, that is the path that God is calling us to be those kinds of leaders and influencers. And then finally, in this verse, not a lover of money. This can also be translated as not avaricious, or in other words, not greedy for wealth or material gain. Elders cannot be controlled by a desire to acquire things for themselves. They cannot have lives oriented around increasing their bank account or material possessions. This one really gives me pause as I look at my life and habits. I'd venture to say that it does or should give most Christian geeks pause when we read this. So much of being geeky involves acquiring or paying for new things or experiences, whether physical or digital. My wife is wonderful with numbers and organization, and so almost first thing in our marriage, we work together to develop a budget with numerous subcategories, including a weekly allotment of what we call fun money that we can each use for all of our personal entertainment spending. Over the years, we've continued to come back to discussing our budget, modifying it to fit our varying, changing financial seasons in life. I check to make sure I'm not overspending in my fun money category and almost always wait for significant price reductions or sales before making my entertainment purchases. So there are ways in which I think I'm being fairly self-disciplined and keeping a love of money at bay, but I certainly still have some love for money I have to battle, and ways I haven't been really truly tested in this area. When we are tightening things up financially, the fun money category is one of the last places that I want to reduce. And when we have had to do that over the years, it's been very sobering for me. I also, especially in the last 5 years or so, have had access to entertainment that I don't have to pay for out of my fun money, such as streaming services that we get sporadically for a month at a time in order for me to review something. The subscription service I have to DC Universe Infinite for content creation purposes, or the much more rare instances of a video game purchase made specifically for review or content creation. In the work I do, for as long as God allows me to do this particular kind of work, I'm just not at risk of having no access to entertainment. Now, it's often not entertainment I'm personally most interested in or excited about, but I still have no shortage of access to entertainment experiences. All that to say, I don't feel like I can confidently speak to this issue when I don't feel like I've truly been tested in it for a long time. But I do think that having and sticking to a set, modest budget for entertainment spending has been good for my heart over the years and has forced me to develop some contentment. Contentment and thankfulness have been two disciplines that have made a real difference in keeping me from just endlessly consuming and letting that spending get out of control. And creative frugality, which I developed growing up in my parents' home. I didn't grow up in an especially wealthy home, just two public school teachers. And so we had to develop creative frugality in our home growing up, and that's certainly been enormously helpful to me as well. In summary, all of these qualities in verse 3 are ultimately these more granular details related to the broader issue of self-control. For a church leader to be equipped to help lead and guide others in shaping their lives to conform to Christ, they need to have experience yielding their own lives to Christ in a consistent, patterned, ingrained way. In order to make wise decisions that are going to have a great effect on an entire community of believers, they need to be free of controlling feelings that could warp their decision-making. They need to be shaped in such a way that those they lead are seeing some of these qualities in them. This is one of the big problems with us as Christians primarily looking to learn and be shaped by internet resources and public figures or products and people, that we're not living life with. I say often that, all of these things that we can choose to kind of learn from, equip ourselves with, these are good supplements, but they are pitiful replacements for local church community led by qualified elders. Likewise, if we as geeks want to be used by the Holy Spirit to influence others, really the internet is not the best place for that. It doesn't have the greatest potential for that, certainly, far from it. How easy have you and I found it to dismiss someone's thoughts about a very relevant issue in our lives because we just think we hear their opinion, we hear their thoughts or whatever, and we're like, well, they don't, I don't know them. I don't know if they've really been living this out themselves. They don't know me. What about my situation and the particulars of my situation? There's a lot less potential for the kind of teaching we take in to really kind of penetrate and really speak to our specific situations when we don't know the people personally and how they're living their lives, and they don't know about our specific situations. When people don't know much more than our names and the curated slices of our lives that we put online, we only have so much potential to influence. I think that's the way that it should be. If we really want to be used by God to influence others, we should start seriously looking at the qualifications for elders and consider how we can grow in them as we live life alongside other believers. Because these qualifications we're looking at, seen by others who are sharing the same oxygen space with us, are what a life looks like when it's really having the right kind of impact and influence on others. Well, tell me what you think of that. How's that striking you? What are you pondering right now? You can let me know in the comments. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.